Katie, welcome to the Way Champions podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm super excited. We had never met. I sat next to you at the U.S. House of Representatives. We got to chat after. I was just so blown away by your testimony and the things you talked about there. I just turned to you. I was like, "You want to come on the podcast?" And thankfully, you said yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's awesome. Why don't you just tell people a little bit about what you do and the work you're doing? And certainly you had been advising more on a lot of college sports stuff before that testimony on youth sports. But talk about the work that you do.
Sure, I'd love to. So, I am an antitrust lawyer by trade. I was in litigation for 20 years, mostly bringing plaintiffs' class action lawsuits, including one against Varsity Cheer that I talked about a little bit at the hearing. And an opportunity came my way to join American Economic Liberties Project and go into the policy world, which really means advocating for ideas in with respect. And at AALP, that's about pro-enforcement policies for antitrust, meaning improving competition in our economy and taking on economic powers that harm American workers, small businesses, and consumers. And
Mhm.
so that's really our big goal. And through that, I started working on NCAA issues and got interested in what was going on in youth sports, seeing private equity takeovers and trying to understand that. And the more I read about it, the more I felt like this was a story that really needed to be heard.
Yeah, and it is such an interesting story because it's really changed so much in the last 10 years maybe is when we first started hearing about this. And I think also I want to start with the youth sports thing, but everything that happens at the NCAA level has an effect on high school sports. And what happens in high school sports affects and middle school affects youth, and so everything trickles down. And so you can't say, "Oh, well, that's for 20-year-olds," because what happens to 20-year-olds affects everyone on down the ladder. And what we've now seen in youth sports is, you know, the professionalization in a bad way of a lot of things. I think coaches should be professional. I think organizations should be professional, but I don't know that having athletes be treated like tiny professionals is a good thing.
I completely agree with that. You know, certainly a lot of youth sports today is chasing college scholarships, and now it's not just chasing college scholarships, it's chasing NIL money.
Hmm.
And so I think that we have to be really cognizant of the fact that most people don't get to play college. Most kids don't get to play college sports, and those that do don't all get the big
Hmm.
segment of the college athlete population. And so when we think about youth sports, I think it's really important that it's remained something that's available to all kids to have fun and learn how to work as a team and learn about grit and how you have to put your nose to the grindstone to accomplish things, and that it's not all just about chasing the almighty dollar.
Yeah. One of the things that I've learned in all the speaking that I do in the communities that I go to is, for a lot of communities, maybe a Washington, D.C. area or New York City or Southern California, a lot of those families that can afford this, they don't even care about the scholarship. Like they don't even need the money. It's admissions as well. Admission
That's
preferences for athletes into elite colleges, as we saw with the Varsity Blues scandal, is a massive thing that we can't overlook. And it's interesting. And people say, "What changes the system?" I'm like, we've had now where we have colleges removing legacy admissions and other types of admissions. If they removed admission preferences for athletes, would people really chase after this so much? I don't know. It's interesting.
I think that's a great question to ask. You're right, it gives a huge admission boost to students, and that admission boost overwhelmingly favors upper class white kids. It doesn't help, the admission boost isn't going to lower income families that really need it. It doesn't promote advancement and moving up into a different income bracket. It cements people where they are.
So, talk about maybe let's start with your involvement in the varsity sports lawsuit and talk about what that is, because I think that's a great sort of segue into understanding this top to bottom model that's becoming far more and more prevalent in youth sport and what's happening there.
Yeah, Varsity Brands is a really interesting business. It started as an innovator. The founder invented competitive cheerleading. But as they grew, they found more and more ways to sort of keep, and as the sport grew, to keep their iron grip on the sport and to keep competitors from coming in and enjoying the benefits of a new and growing sport. I represented with a group of other lawyers cheer gyms, and that's how competitive cheerleading teams are formed and trained, and how and they're the heart of the competition. So kids go to these cheer gyms, they try out, they're put on a team, and that's where they learn the high flying acrobatics and gymnastics and the cheer routines that they do. It's what you see on ESPN. And it is a huge sport in the United States. I think it's they Varsity actually just formed a professional league. There's been efforts to have it become an Olympic sport. What Varsity did was they really created, what people in the business call an ecosystem, what we in the antitrust world call a walled garden. So Varsity owns the competitions that these teams go to. They own the largest apparel company that sells the glitzy uniforms with the Swarovski crystals on them. They had a number of their employees and former employees on the board of the governing body, that's the
Mhm.
U.S. All-Star Federation. They locked up venues so that if somebody wanted to start their own cheer event, they wouldn't be able to find anywhere to host it. In competitive cheerleading, all-star cheerleading, the big event is called Worlds. I
Mhm.
believe it's in Florida every year. And what the way it works is these teams go to events, and events are given the ability to award bids to go to
Mhm.
Worlds.
Mhm.
And so Varsity, via its control of USASF, decided who got the bids. And of course,
Mhm.
they gave those bids to the events that they owned. And
Mhm.
so it really creates this flywheel that makes it impossible for any sort of competitor to come in. And so we represented cheer gyms who were really getting strangled by the rising costs of fielding these teams, buying the uniforms, paying entry fees. There was another lawsuit on behalf of parents who also obviously paid the gyms for all of this. And it ultimately resulted in about $126 million in settlements for the gyms and the parents.
Wow.
Varsity agreed to um, relinquish a number of its board seats and to stop some of the ways it would sort of tie its businesses together. So to limit that they would give discounts on their uniforms if you only attended varsity events. So they
Mhm.
agreed not to do that anymore.
Mhm.
Um, and they still, I mean, I'll acknowledge they still do have a pretty good hold on the industry, but I think it's gone a long way. They also, I think we can't talk about them without mentioning the sex abuse scandals that are also plaguing that sport, and that are occurring at varsity events and with coaches who are affiliated with varsity. That's all still being litigated. I'm not involved in that. Certainly can't
Mhm.
comment on it, but it's very serious, and I think is a really good illustration of the dangers of one company controlling an entire sport.
Yeah, and I wasn't familiar with it until you brought it up there and you sent me an article that you had written and some of the information on this, and it was really fascinating because this certainly anyone listening to this could probably point to an example of this in numerous other sports. First with you, do you know of other sports since that as other sports, anyone approached you or anyone involved and said, "Hey, can we do this?" Because I understand, like, if I have a gym and I have a good team and I can't get into the events, but my neighboring gym can, well, then kids leave to the neighboring gym.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And that's a problem because I can have
Yep.
great coaching and a great team, but if I'm out of the system, then my business is affected and I can't get in, right? There's no way into the system.
Absolutely, you're describing it perfectly. There's been a lot of coverage lately of Black Bear Sports, which has a similar control over a lot of different prongs of youth hockey.
Mm,
They and in particular there they own a significant portion of the ice hockey rinks or the hockey rinks, I should say, in
mhm.
the Midwest and the East Coast. And that's a particular problem because it's not easy to build another hockey rink. That's a
Super
major
expensive. Yeah.
undertaking that requires huge amounts of capital. It requires significant, there's, enormous upkeep and operating expenses. And so I think what it looks like they've done, just from observations, what I've read is they're buying up all the hockey rinks. Their CEO and some of their vice presidents, like Varsity, have seats on some youth hockey federations and youth
Mhm.
leagues. And so so by doing that, they set the rules. They get to decide who has access to their rinks. At the same time, they own a lot of clubs. They also own the ranking system that
Mhm.
ranks youth hockey teams, which is particularly problematic.
Mm.
And I think it raises a lot of red flags that certainly concern me, for all the reasons you just said, particularly the ranking systems and ownership of facilities. So, we'll see what happens there given the amount of public scrutiny they're getting right now.
Mhm.
But it's problematic just from a 3,000 foot perspective.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, you mentioned the facilities, and this is sort of, what's happened, I think, across the country is that municipalities have abdicated the responsibility for building youth sports facilities. Throughout
Hmm.
the world, that's what, right? The city, the town builds the fields, builds the rinks. Even in Canada, like, most of them are town and city owned rinks so everyone gets access to it. When we were in Congress, Tom Ferry talked about this and he talked about it on the podcast here recently. Um, the US is now collecting $400 million of money from sports betting. What if instead of the going into the giant pot of whatever, what if that was dedicated to building sports facilities around the world or around the country? Like, what a cool use of the intangible use of that money.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting approach to to addressing the problem of funding for youth sports and then the massive amount of money that's going into gambling.
Yeah.
Right now, I've seen that proposed by the Commission on the State of Olympics as well. I think it's a very creative way to address both of those industries.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes the vice can pay for the good or the thing against it for sure. Yeah. And so, hockey, to go back to Black Bear Sports, like hockey is a really interesting example because it might be the most expensive facility.
Hmm.
And you also then can't just build a hockey rink and say, we're just going to play for 6 months and shut it down for 6 months, right? Because
Hmm.
you got to pay for that multi-million-dollar facility. And so now you need those teams and those kids coming to summer camps playing year round. And now you're also injuring kids from that perspective as well. Not injuring, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You're not doing what's best for kids.
Yeah, and it's important when you think about a single entity, we'll call it a monopoly, getting control of one market. Here are the market's access to ice rinks, right? It's really hard to put checks and balances on that. So, for example, there was also reporting about the Dallas Stars buying up all the ice rinks in North Texas, and some of those are ice rinks that they bought from municipalities and said they would lease them back. And the reporting I read said that they put all these conditions in the contract that the Stars had to provide equal access to the ice rink and provide access to teams on equal terms. And teams are saying they're not doing that. They're retaliating against us. If we don't use the coaches they want us to use, they'll up our prices. And, they're not following the rules in the contract about how much they're allowed to charge teams. So it's hard to police that stuff. It creates this system where the onus becomes on the youth sports operator to police the monopolist to force them to comply with the terms. And that's something that's really hard to do. It's hard to put your neck out there when
Mhm.
you're dealing with an entity with that kind of power.
Yeah, very much so. I'm just looking through some notes here because it's interesting. I don't know if I'll find it. I spent some time at an event with someone from the Dallas Stars, and right when all that reporting came out, I asked him about this, and of course, there's two sides to everything. But what was really fascinating about his presentation at this event was, the Dallas Stars came from Minnesota, the biggest hockey state in the whole country, and went to Texas, um, and invested heavily in the community, in facilities and youth hockey and all that. And so he put up a thing of how many rinks there were and how many players there are in Dallas versus Houston, where there is no
Hmm.
investment. And so they've grown the sport of hockey an incredible amount by doing this, where that maybe I'm gonna make up I was hoping I had the number at my fingers here, but it was like there's now 80 rinks and tens of thousands of players in Dallas, and there's three rinks and a couple thousand players in Houston. So
Hmm.
there's good and bad, right? But I think your point is like great that you're building facilities, great that this, but when you control every aspect and all of a sudden close the door unless you march in lockstep with everything, that's when it becomes a problem.
Exactly. And that's a classic monopoly issue. Once somebody gains a monopoly, their business interests no longer they don't have to worry about gaining customers because they're the only game in town, right? So
Mhm.
their interests aren't in improving their services, improving the facility, giving better prices. Their interest is protecting the monopoly to keep other people out, and that's where most of their efforts and their expenditures are going to go.
Mhm. Um, Maybe it's a good time to talk about private equity because we can have these giant entities that control things nationally, but on the same thing, if I live in sort of an isolated town, that is the one club that owns the one facility that then is a business that gets bought up by some private equity money.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter that they don't own whatever. It just matters what happens in my community.
Yeah.
And so what, I mean, I think the big thing is like, just for our listeners who aren't maybe familiar with it, the purpose, right, of a private equity is shareholder value, right? Or to make
Yes.
money for their investors. It's not like
Yeah.
you said, make youth soccer better for these kids. It's make money for the investors. And what happens then is prices go up, um, people get knocked out, and money gets invested in marketing and not coach development.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean you're correct. So the private equity model is high returns in a short amount of time. I think it's somewhere around 5 to 10 years is usually the most amount of time they want to spend invested in a company before they sell off their interests.
Mhm.
And so when they come in and buy up a youth sports league, the goal is to extract as much profit from that league as they can in a short amount of time. And they do that in a number of ways that don't just involve monopolizing an industry, right? So one thing, but it's ways that are harmful to the company in the long term because they're not interested in the long term. So you see things like what's called dividend recapitalization, which just means that they take out a loan against the company to pay their investors dividends. They also charge the companies lots of management fees and transaction fees. There's also a tactic called asset stripping, where they'll, like, say you buy a youth sports league that owns its own arena, they might sell the arena to another one of their portfolio companies and then lease it back for pretty unreasonable terms to the league. Or they might sell off IP to another one of their port IP and then sign a contract to
Yeah,
for
license it
rights to
back
use
or whatever.
rights
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the IP. Um, and there's less interest in maintaining facilities. And you're right, there's growth interest certainly, and they do that through roll-ups by buying up all the small little companies that are all over the place, and they're all small transactions. They don't cost enough money to trigger the attention or reporting requirements of the Department of Justice or the FTC.
Hmm.
And so you're right that there are other harms other than just the monopolization of the industry that can happen with private equity. That's why it's such a concern of folks in my space
Yeah.
and
Go
of a
ahead.
lot of other people who I think experience it when a private equity company comes in and buys whatever local company it is that they have grown to love, and suddenly the services are downgraded. When they bought Walgreens, they took away all the holiday paid leave for federal holidays from Walgreens employees. There's all kinds of practices that people experience every day that are very, very frustrating.
And I think one of the first things you said is the most important, which maybe I wasn't thinking about, which is it's a very short time frame to extract value out, pay dividends annually, and extract value within 5 to 10 years. So it's not a long-term view of what can we do with this commodity. And the commodity
Hmm.
is made up of children who are supposed to be having a sporting experience.
Hmm.
And it's like, how can we get the most money from these families in 5 to 10 years and then maybe exit our
Yeah,
share of it? Not
yeah.
how can we build an infrastructure so it keeps getting better and better for these kids?
Exactly. Varsity's gone through three different large private equity firms in, I think, 10 or 15 years. That it was Charles Capital, then Bain, and now they're owned by KKR in a very short amount of time.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of shocked that it took private equity this long to realize what a cash cow youth sports was. Because
Hmm.
one thing about youth sports is like, when people tell me like, oh, we're losing money, I'm like, how? Because just raise your prices, because usually no one blinks an eye.
Hmm.
If it's, now I'm not saying this is a good thing, but if it's $1,500 or $2,000 to play soccer and next year it's 2,200, and I've been part of, like I coached a long time, I've been part of clubs that had to raise our fees to pay for field rentals or build fields or whatever we had to do. And I mean, I could count on one hand in a, 600 person competitive program. I could count on one hand the amount of people who, when we raised prices 10%, wrote an email in and said, "This is crazy." Everyone just kind of paid the money and moved on.
Yeah,
I'm like, how do you
it's
lose
what we
money?
call it's what we call a highly inelastic market, inelastic demand, which is, yeah, one of the things that makes it very attractive to private investment firms.
Yeah, they don't, I don't want my kid to leave her team or his team like our coach. So we're going to kind of suck it up and find the extra $200 or whatever.
Hmm.
So it's not shocking that they've started looking at these clubs and as a way to do that, but it's just so scary because we've seen all the effect of all the entrances. What we haven't seen is maybe the effect of the private equity exits from all these
Hmm.
organizations here when they've sold off the field. And maybe it reverts to community ownership and they're like, well, where are we getting $500,000 to rent our ice rink back?
Yeah, but more likely it's sold to another private equity
More,
firm, unfortunately.
more likely. Um, what can we do? I mean, what can be done when it's not as big as maybe a varsity that it's clearly anti-competitive and it's just local pockets of anti-competitiveness? Like, well, what are people to do to combat this?
Well, I think it's a hard problem because we want youth sports and we want kids to be able to enjoy them. Um, I think the very first thing is to put a stop to this vertical integration. There's a huge conflict of interest to have a seat on a board and to own a league and to own a ranking system and to own a facility. That should absolutely not be allowed. Not just for competition, but not just for antitrust purposes, but also just for like fundamental fairness of
Just
sports
governance and
purposes,
yeah.
sports governance. It's a huge conflict of interest and it shouldn't be happening. Um, there are other there are other things that some that our antitrust agencies have already implemented that need to action changes in rules, not laws, but rules in terms of what has to be reported to keep an eye on serial acquisitions and roll-ups, which is just the buying of all the little companies, the
Mhm.
little leagues all over the place, which is how they've acquired this power. From a local level, I think that that's where folks like you come in who really understand how these leagues operate on the ground um, and have compassion for parents and really care about the kids and helping them to navigate this world. I think we have to have funding. The funding for youth sports is just absolutely critical here because if there isn't government funding, if there isn't even grants of it, I'm not advocating against private investment in sports leagues. That's fine.
Mhm.
It's the practices that happen when they get rolled up and integrated that are really the biggest problems. But having grants and funding so that these leagues can operate and so that there are other options. But it's an uphill battle. I understand that. And certainly there's a bit of an arms race. It's hard when you're a parent. And, I've been through this with my kids where you're saying, well, do I put them on the rec league or I'd love for them to be in the rec league and I'll save thousands of dollars. But if I put them in the rec league, are they even going to have a chance to play in high school?
Mhm.
Like that's a tough call as a parent. And so that gets back to again making sure sports are available in schools so that parents are given this rock and a hard place position where
Mhm.
it's spending thousands of dollars or your kid can't play high school sports. That
Yeah.
shouldn't be the analysis that parents are having to make.
Yeah.
Those sports should be available to the kids regardless. I'm not very athletic, but I got to play JV tennis in high school because I liked it. I wasn't good, but
Yeah.
I got to at least try, and now I play tennis as an adult.
Yeah.
And in today's world, I wouldn't get to play high school tennis.
Yeah. What's interesting is um it's funny, but there's a lot of obviously pushback from the concussions and injuries against American football, but yet it
Hmm.
also might be the most egalitarian sport left
Yeah,
because middle schools and high schools sponsor it, and that's where kids play, right? And they play a
yeah.
kind of a season because you can't play year round. And maybe, yes, for specialty positions, quarterbacks, there's more to it. But for the vast majority of kids, playing football is a low cost government school funded thing. And it's real. I don't know another sport that is.
That's a great point. I really, really love that thought. And, it gets to the specialization issue, which is something that, again, a private equity firm with massive holdings in leagues across the United States, their goal is to get people enrolled and keep them enrolled. So they're going to promote specialization and promote year-round play. A local league might understand that they want their athletes, their kids to be healthy and not do that. A soccer season doesn't go all year in a local
Hmm.
league.
Hmm.
Um, no, a baseball season doesn't go all year in Little League. So, I think that that's another that when you talk about solutions is educating the coaches, educating the parents. This isn't actually good for your kid.
And
JJ Watt tw was tweeting about it today.
was he?
Specialization
Wow.
is bad.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, there's no argument from the sports scientists and from the psychologists and whatever that being a generalist before you're a specialist isn't helpful. That being an athlete before you're a tennis player or a soccer player is helpful. And different sports require different hours of practice and amounts of practice. You can't argue against that either. And so
Hmm.
some you'll have to put in more early hours than others. And at the same time, the incentive, is not the 0.01% who turned professional who had to put in those hours. It's when every kid, regardless of ability and level of interest, is forced to put in those hours if they want access to
Hmm.
the ice. That's the problem.
Yeah, Tom talks a lot about that, right?
Hmm.
About Tom Ferry, about
Hmm.
how yes, there should be a path for elite players. Absolutely, for them
Hmm.
to train and reach the pinnacle of their sport. But there needs to be an option for everybody else too. And it shouldn't be the professionalized version.
Yeah. Does, I mean, is this where there's a role for government? Certainly in the US, and the analogy that I once heard and now I use, they said, if we learn tomorrow, and don't panic anyone, that drinking coffee before 12 p.m. uh, shortens your life by 10 years. Nine coffee shops would say we'll open at 12, and one would say there's a business opportunity, right?
Yeah.
And that's the problem when we leave it only to business. And we have numerous examples of environmental pollution and so many things when it's like, oh, business will place itself. No, because that's not their incentive. Their incentive is shareholder value and paying dividends and doing that. They're not incentivized to save the environment or serve children. They're incentivized to make money. Is
Hmm.
this where there is a role for government, and what could that role be?
Absolutely. And, that's where you get into the issue of the Amateur Sports Act and the U.S. Olympic Committee and the national governing bodies that fall under that committee and what their role is. And some of those national governing bodies, I think, actually are pretty involved in the youth at the youth sports level in training. In training and creating guidelines and that sort of thing, but a lot of them aren't, and it's not necessarily their fault. They don't have the funding. And so,
Right.
yes, I absolutely think that having national governing bodies having actual authority over the system is would be really beneficial.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard, right? And that's the problem with our Olympic sports system compared to the rest of the world, where it is
Hmm.
government funded or funded by some sort of tax or oil revenue or whatever it is. And ours is figure it out. And the safe sports system, we won't even go there, right? We had a congressional
Yikes.
mandate to, protect tens of millions of children. And oh, by the way, you get $0 to do it. Figure it
Hmm.
out, right? And then what a nice punching bag for when it gets
Yeah, and
screwed
then
up, and we can blame someone, but it's like, what are we supposed to do? But
and
yeah,
your
yeah, I mean,
char and the entities are charged per report. So the more you report, the more you have to pay, which disincentivizes
which
actually disclosing anything.
it's insane. And I've talked to people who are, head people of Olympic governing sports, and they're like, if I talk to, and I'm just making up, Coca-Cola, and I'm asking them to sponsor gymnastics, or, but let's go away from gymnastics, speed skating, right? They want their name on the speed skater winning a gold medal. You
Hmm.
don't really, it's not going to sell Coke to fund junior speed skating in Minnesota,
Yeah.
right? So when we're
Right.
saying we're not giving you any money for that, and you get your sponsors, well, they want to be attached to the highest level. So then, then we rely on our system of, throw 100 eggs against the wall. If one doesn't break, we say, we have an Olympic speed skating champion.
Yeah.
It's a little messy. Let's shift gears and talk about some of the stuff that you're doing with the NCAA. And I wrote down this quote. Let's just start talking about the SCORE Act, and this is currently in Congress and something that
Hmm.
you've done some work and maybe testified against. And I don't know if I took this quote maybe from an article that you wrote, but I just want to read it. It says the SCORE Act, the result of an NCAA lobbying campaign that cost more than $15 million, would overturn the Supreme Court's unanimous 2021 ruling that the NCAA and its member schools were running an illegal wage fixing cartel, that amateurism was a myth they couldn't rely on anymore, and that they did not have antitrust immunity. Can you talk about that? And I think you wrote that, right? Did I steal that
Yeah,
quote from you?
I
Okay,
did.
good.
That was for
Perfect.
an op-ed I wrote. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So talk about that.
Yeah, so the SCORE Act just failed spectacularly on the Hill right before you and I testified. I think it was the week before. It
Mhm.
was the culmination of, I guess, a 4.5 years of lobbying by the NCAA and the conferences to get antitrust immunity, which just means that the antitrust laws don't apply to them.
Mhm.
And the antitrust immunity is something that is really, really disfavored in the law, because our antitrust laws were created out of these like really egalitarian democratic principles. There's a quote that I'm going to paraphrase from John Sherman, the
Mhm.
architect of the Sherman Act, that was,
Mhm.
if we won't tolerate a king over our systems of government, we shouldn't tolerate a king over our systems of commerce.
Mhm.
And so it's designed to correct power imbalances and to prevent the sort of monopolies we were just talking about, right? When we do have antitrust exemptions, they're usually to correct another power imbalance. So, for instance, workers, there's a antitrust exemption that applies to, I'll start with farmers. They're allowed to come together and form cooperatives and sell their crops as a unit to counterbalance the really big power of the large
Agro
buyers
business.
of
Yeah, yeah,
meat
yeah.
and grain and all of these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
There's an exemption that applies to workers that allows them to come together and unionize to balance out against the power of large employers who they usually don't have much bargaining power with. So the NCAA was saying, well, we want an antitrust exemption, but what this would do is really just like cement what is a monopoly power over college sports and make it even stronger. So it really
Mhm.
went against over 100 years of principles of competition in our economy that have governed our entire economy for a very long time. Um, it They could not get the votes. It didn't have they couldn't get enough Republicans on board. They tried to get the Congressional Black Caucus on board, who has a lot of concerns about HBCUs being able to keep up with the college athletics arms race, but
Mhm.
they weren't buying it, and
Mhm.
it got pulled.
Yeah, you had a great quote in your article from Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who said, "Nowhere else in America can businesses get away with agreeing not to pay their workers a fair market rate on the theory that their product is defined by not paying their workers a fair market rate." And yeah, and I think it's so fascinating, right? Like, this system that for years and years, schools made gazillions, and um, you'd have athletes who like couldn't afford to fly home to see their sick mom.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, the school made millions selling their jersey that season. Meanwhile, if someone said, "Hey, here's a plane ticket," that athlete was ineligible.
Yeah. And I think when you started seeing coaches with like Kirby Smart with a $13 million contract, Lane Kiffin just signed one that's worth what, $91 million, I
Right.
think. Um,
With guaranteed buyouts if they get
guar
fired.
Guaranteed buyouts. multi-million dollar stadiums. My alma mater, TCU, just built this snow room that's like the crazy. It's the only one in North America. I've never seen anything like it. It
Hmm.
gets really hard, and all of the revenue that's supporting that is generated by players in a game. It's you just can't justify it anymore. The system really crumbled under its own weight.
Yeah, like the
Um,
Ivy League could say, "Hey, you got a scholarship." Well, Ivy doesn't give scholarships, but
yeah,
they'll give aid, right?
they're
You're
facing
getting
their own antitrust lawsuit about that right now.
right, exactly. But something like, back when it was like, hey, you're getting the ability to come to school for free, that then has turned into these gigantic businesses
Hmm.
generating so much money, generating big salaries for the people running it, and the athletes getting nothing. And then the problem also is if you're an athlete who has a severe injury during your time there and then you're done, you're just like cast off, right? There was no
Hmm.
lifelong disability from your employer. I mean, what do you think NCAA athletes, when I talk to coaches, and I've talked to a lot of retired NCAA basketball and football coaches on this podcast, and I ask them about the current system, and they're like, we need contracts. They need to be
Hmm.
employees. Like they also shouldn't be able to jump from school to school to school to school. We need to fix a transfer portal. I mean, is that what you see coming down the pipeline? Is that what has to happen?
Yeah, and just recently, but we're seeing more and more support coming from like current and former athletic directors from Tennessee and I think Florida, Bruce Pearl, I, you know, Jim Harbaugh has spoken in favor of this. The contract issue is a big one, and we're now seeing like really complicated issues coming out with all of these NIL contracts and what's his name, Damian Williams, I think, from
There was a guy from
Washington.
Georgia that just went to Missouri, then now
Yeah.
Georgia's suing him
Hmm.
for breaking his
Yeah, and
contract.
so this chaos, people who are advocate the NCAA and its supporters always talk about the Wild West, but it's really the Wild West of their own making because
Yeah.
they don't want to acknowledge that these kids are employees, and it's really just an arcane way to think about it. There's no, there are lots of kids on campus that are employees of the school working in the cafeteria or as a RA who are also students. You can have both of those things coexist.
Yeah.
But given the amount of money that is flying around, it
Hmm.
is nonsensical to not have some sort of uniform system. And also, getting back to this antitrust exemption we were talking about, if they would let, for instance, all the football players unionize and negotiate with them, that would be the contract would be subject to an antitrust exemption. They wouldn't be able to challenge it as being anti-competitive.
Hmm.
And so you would be able to have a more uniform system with transfer rules and salary caps, just like we see in the NBA and then in the NFL and the NHL and the MLB. This exists in other sports, and it's very unclear to me why it can't exist in here.
Is it, I don't know if the word fair is correct, or is it a good thing that some of the highest paid employees of a university or a state are 18-year-old college football freshmen? Is that
Well,
a
I
good
mean, they're
thing?
generating more money than most state
But most of
employees,
these athletic
right?
departments are losing money. So maybe the football
Yeah.
team's making money, but field hockey and soccer and wrestling are all losing money. So
Yeah, and that's a complicated question, I think, how to handle the fact that how do you handle that revenue? You have to think about Title IX.
yeah, I was going
Certainly,
to
I
ask about that.
understand that people don't want to lose, and our Olympic sports structure is basically that the universities are the ones who create and train who create the programs and train the athletes. So there's a lot, I think there's going to be a lot of change in college sports, and we probably don't know what it all is.
Yeah.
Um, the cash problem, I understand it's hard for the universities that aren't Ohio State and University of Texas with the really valuable IP and all of the
Hmm.
money. But I don't think it's fair to say, well, so t too bad for you, star quarterback, you don't get any of it.
How do you how do you balance that with, and I realize I might be like pushing outside of your area of expertise, but how do I
That's
balance
okay.
something like Title IX with the star men's point guard in basketball is going to bring in a lot more revenue than the star women's point guard in basketball, Caitlin Clark maybe being an exception.
Hmm.
How do I balance what I pay either each of them?
You're right. It is Title IX is definitely outside of my area of expertise. I've learned a little bit about it as I've been working on all this, and it's a very hard question.
Hmm.
It's very hard because I don't think we want to lose the protections of Title IX because without it, women's sports wouldn't have developed into what we have today with
Hmm.
WNBA and women's soccer and really exciting things that are happening for female athletes. Gymnastics and the NIL opportunities that are available to those young women. I've seen I don't know if she's still the WNBA president, but a WNBA president talking about how NIL has been great for the WNBA because these women are coming out of college with established brands that they didn't used to have.
Hmm.
Um, so it's really, really important and we need it. And how to make all that work together is a question that I'll be honest, I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you said it perfectly. The NCAA created the Wild West, and now they've gone, "Whoop, we're
Yeah.
done. And they're waiting for Congress, which doesn't do anything, regardless of your political affiliation. They don't really legislate anymore. They wait for the president or the courts to do all the legislating for them, and we're relying on them to maybe do something. But it also seems like this could be something that could unite parties. Like I think
Yeah.
whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, if you're from Ohio, Ohio State football matters, right? As does women's lacrosse, right? And
Hmm.
so it seems like this could be a unite, just like when we testified I, you know, if you mixed up all the seating, you wouldn't have really known. For most part, Democrat, Republican, it's like kids' access to sports. Most people care about that.
Yeah, I think that that's right. Just a second,
Yeah,
I dropped my.
yeah, no worries. It happens, right? This is real world. I could have a dog barking, a train go by anytime.
I think that that's right. You certainly saw that in the SCORE Act not being able to make it out of the House when the House has a majority.
Hmm.
Um, I think that it's hard for some of I know when the NCAA was lobbying for the SCORE Act, there were not just NCAA representatives, but administrators from universities camped out in their offices and saying, we need this to pass, we need this to pass. And one of the things that I would tell people when tell staffers and other people when they asked me about this was like, bill is not good for the universities. This is a short-term fix because the bill doesn't just let the NCAA decide how athletes are compensated. It gives them carte blanche to decide which schools even get to participate in the sports,
Hmm.
which is enormous. If you get to say without any oversight which schools can be in Division I FBS football and eligible for the college football playoff, that's an extraordinary power.
I mean, we are already seeing that with just this year's college football playoff, and well, why were these two teams there and not Notre Dame or
Mhm.
whatever? And so it's so, and where's the creep of the football playoff that went from 2 to 4 to 12, and now they want 16, and once they have 16, they'll want whatever's the next number up.
Yeah,
You
but
know?
it's interesting because you're seeing more parity too, right? Like Indiana is the number one
It's
football
awesome.
team in the country. That's a
Yeah.
wild thing to be happening when what we were existing in before was just the SEC and Big Ten, mostly the SEC, winning national championships over and over again. And you're seeing what happens when a cartel gets broken up, which is
Hmm.
that the resources, the human capital here is being spread out amongst the schools
Hmm.
because like Alabama can't over recruit and sit all the top players from the South on the bench behind the top players they
Hmm.
recruited the year before and then
Hmm.
hold them there in perpetuity because they can't transfer and they
Hmm.
can't get a scholarship and they can't get an NIL deal. Instead, if you over recruit, that kid's gonna go somewhere else and he's
Right.
gonna be a star there
And I would
or
just
her.
say, and the issue as a college athlete and former college coach and someone who works with college teams is I think I would find very few people, if any, who would say, you know what, an athlete should always be able to transfer once.
Yeah.
But when I watch an NCAA Final Four basketball game, they're like, this kid's on his fourth school in 5 years. That's not right either.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that that's fair. I think
Yeah.
that that's fair. You know, and I think that I certainly can appreciate the problems that causes
Hmm.
from a team building and coaching perspective.
Yeah.
My point is more that what we're seeing is an evening out where coaches are operating on a more even playing field in terms of
Hmm.
recruiting. The way it worked before, the
Oh, I
idea
agree.
that it was an even playing field was really a fiction.
Yeah.
But no, I completely understand where you're coming from. And I think that if you go back to collective bargaining and unionization, you can you can negotiate those things. And, the players'
Hmm.
union reps would be negotiating within the economic realities of the system and how much the schools can afford and what's reasonable in terms of team building and all of those things. So I get that, but
Hmm.
also mobility is important for players to be able to get what they're worth.
Yeah.
I think that what's going on with Washington and Damian Williams is very odd, and who knows what happened there, and I certainly understand why people don't like it.
Can you tell a little perspective? Some because definitely some of our listeners will have no idea what that is.
Sure. So he's a quarterback, right?
Yeah.
Damian Williams signed a NIL deal and contract with the University of Washington to stay on as their quarterback. And then I think it was within a few days, put his name in the transfer portal and is supposed to be going to LSU. Is that right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I'm not sure.
and
I don't keep up. Yeah.
it's causing a huge kerfuffle because obviously he said he would do one thing and then a few days later apparently changed his mind. But then, and so you question like what happened here? What was his thinking? What's the school's thinking? University of Washington is very angry about it. They're saying they're not going to let him put his name in the transfer portal. But then when you get down to it, John, you look at I've seen the form contract for the Big Ten's players, and it's incredibly onerous on the players. They have a liquidated damages clause that says he would owe University of Washington $4 million to
Hmm.
transfer, which is, so it's like you have these two crazy, outrageous things that are happening. And I think it's because we don't have this like reasonable arm's length negotiation process that could happen between the schools or the conferences and players union
And their
reps.
players to come up with a number that says, "Hey, this is fair," and to come up with
Yeah,
a
and
number
this is
of
how long,
transfers.
like, you have to stay at least 2 years once you commit. Like, that's reasonable.
Hmm.
I think it is, but what do I know? I'm not a football coach.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah,
With
there's, if you
exceptions
would,
like if your coach leaves, maybe you can leave again or whatever. Yeah. I mean, I
yeah.
think, and again, most of these current college football and or college conferences were built for football, right?
Hmm.
SEC, Big 20, whatever they are now and everything. And it's like, but when you have Stanford playing in the Atlantic Coast Conference, that's a problem,
It's a
right?
huge
And
problem.
Cal and whatever. And so and for football, we have one game, we play on Saturday, we travel, we're fine. You're a baseball player and you're playing 60, 70 games a year. You're, a soccer player playing 2 games a week. You know, you're a college baseball or softball player now. You don't go to in-person class. You can't.
Hmm.
You have to take online classes because you can't play baseball for USC when all your conference games are against Maryland and Rutgers and Ohio and Michigan and so these things are not built for student athletes in any sport beyond football. Even basketball is hard.
Yeah, it really reveals the facade these schools have built when they say, "Well, we're concerned about the educational mission and we want to preserve these players as students." And it's like, well, if you want to preserve these players as students, go back to geographic organization and limit and put reasonable limits on how often they have to travel.
Yeah, yeah. Could they legally, maybe you don't have this answer. I'm just popping my head. Could they say to a football player, come be a football player. That's all you do for Ohio State. And on the back end of it, we're going to give you 5 years of school for free to
Hmm.
use whenever you want. So you can put your mind in, I think I'm going to be in the NFL. And then I get hurt, or then, or because I think the other sort of crime for the student athlete is, well, I was really interested in biology or becoming a teacher, but I wasn't allowed to do that because I was playing a sport and I had to major in general education. If I had the opportunity to go do my degree after my football career was over, after my basketball career was over, um, maybe now that degree means a lot more to me. Maybe now I'm going to study a lot harder. Maybe I'll care
Hmm.
because I don't think I'm going to make $50 million playing my sport.
Seems like a reasonable proposal.
It seems like it, right? So
Hmm.
let's get rid of the facade of you're not student athletes, you're just athletes, but you will let you be a student later on. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know we're drifting here. Any other thoughts? Any other big things you see coming down the pipeline that you think might have a massive effect on college and then trickle down to youth sports in the next couple of years here?
Well, the biggest overlap, John, is certainly private equity in college athletics.
Mm,
Private equity is now moving into college athletics very swiftly. We saw University of Utah's Board of Trustees approve a deal with a firm called Otro Capital, and that's something that I think is really concerning when you're talking about transferring over really valuable media rights and IP rights and all of these things into a for-profit company that a private investment firm has a financial stake in. You start to think about all the same things we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. What kind of control are they going to have? Are they going to cut? Are they going to slash wages and salaries in the athletic department to ramp up profits? Are they going to roll up athletic departments? Are you going to have one firm that owns all of the Big Ten, has ownership stakes in all the Big Ten athletic departments?
mhm.
That's what we saw a conversation about that earlier in the fall with
Yeah,
the UC Investments, which is the University of California Pension Fund,
yeah,
was going to buy a stake in all of Big Ten athletics.
yeah.
So it's private equities everywhere, including in college, and colleges are strapped for cash, and that's a quick fix for them. And I hope that boards of trustees and Congress and our state governments will continue to be vigilant, like we saw with the Big Ten deal getting put on hold to prevent the sort of problems we've seen in other industries where PE is taken over.
How are, again, I've thrown you a few questions that you might be outside of your area, and I think this one is too. But this is something I think about as I have 2 kids in college. Um, uh, and then the college that I went to as well. I grew up in New York, and I went to Fordham University. I think Fordham University right now, for room and board and tuition on campus is like $95,000 a year, right? So how are colleges strapped for cash when their tuition and expense went up like 10 times inflation over the period. I did the math because I was having this conversation with a friend. I My freshman year of college was 1990. Tuition at Fordham at that time I think was $12,000, which in today's dollars is $21,000. So tuition was 21, but except today tuition's 65, right? So how are they strapped for cash?
Wouldn't we all like to know?
Exactly.
Yeah, I would when I was at TCU from 97 to 2001, it was like 16, 17,
Yeah.
$18,000 a
I
year.
had a friend whose son just got into TCU and he's like, we sell our house? Like, what do we do? Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, okay. Well, that's really interesting because certainly that private equity at that level, again, it's going to trickle down somehow. And then I mean, why isn't private equity getting involved in high school sports? Because everyone's local school is strapped for cash as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
Texas high school football where they have $50 million stadiums and, you know, 20,000 people at the games. It seems like private equity would want a piece of that.
Well, and you know what they're talking about with the college sports game day experience is to me, as a college football fanatic, very upsetting. And you know, I've heard PE representatives talking about wanting to turn college game day into a luxury experience like F1 racing and the US Open. And it's like, that is not what college sports fans want.
No.
The vast majority like to tailgate in the parking lot and go into the game and have a good time with all their friends. And it's not, it's there might be a luxury box here and there, but that's not what game day is about.
And private equity says, why don't we sell all the beer in the parking lot?
Yeah,
Why don't we be in charge of all the food? Right? Good luck.
exactly.
Good luck with that. Yeah, I mean, as a soccer person who was so excited to take my kids to World Cup games this summer and to see what FIFA has done with prices and, I can't afford to take two kids to a game at $1,000 a ticket. Like, come on, it's absolutely insane
Hmm.
what they've done to the common fan for soccer. But yeah, I mean, imagine they try to do that for football. Again, it's thinking about it as a business thing instead of a community experience.
Yeah, and that's what sports is supposed to be, the great equalizer, right? It's such a huge part of the fabric of America and how we all grew up. And being able to take your kid to baseball's still the cheapest sport, but it's not that cheap. I mean, being able to have that family experience or experience with your friends is something that should be an enriching experience,
Mhm.
not for us, not for big corporate America.
Yeah, amen. Katie, how can people connect with you? You said you're semi-active on Twitter, or what's the best way for them to follow your work and follow some of the work that you're doing? And I can put links to some of the articles that you sent me in the show notes and everything. But what else?
Sure, my Twitter handle is capital with an O, KVD. I hope I got that right. Um, and my website is kvdstrategies.com, where you can see a lot of the work I've done there. I'm a senior fellow at American Economic Liberties Project and at Berkeley's Civil Justice Research Initiative. So I have a few hats, and if you Google me, you'll find me.
You'll find for sure. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was a fascinating conversation that made my mind go lots of places. And I don't know that we solved any of the world's problems, but we certainly outlined a lot of them. And I know that they are things that the everyday coach and so many parents they're starting to feel this and saying, do we really have to decide between youth sports and family vacation or youth sports and putting my kid through college and things like that. And so, and it's getting better is not necessarily on the horizon unless there's some big changes, right?
Right, and I really appreciate you keeping attention on it and the work you're doing. It's important that we have people everywhere working together. Yeah, the response to my testimony and the clips that ended up online has been overwhelming. I've never seen outreach like this before. One of my colleagues wrote in his Substack, Matt Stoller, that he's prepped a lot of witnesses, and usually nobody pays attention to congressional hearings. So I'm sure you had the same experience, and
I totally
it's
did.
not the norm.
Yeah, I
People
had
really care about this. They really feel it in their hearts and their pocketbooks.
yeah, I mean I don't do much of my own social media, very little bit, but we did one post on that testimony right after and it was like 1 million views. And I'm like, where did that come from? So
Hmm.
people care. This is resonating. Yeah, awesome. Katie, thanks so much for being on the Way of Champions. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for listening. Wow, what a fascinating conversation that went a bunch of different ways. But I just, this idea of business taking over college sport, business taking over high school sport, business taking over youth sport, and what that means for the actual children and participants in sport is kind of a scary thing. And so I'm so grateful for Katie for coming on and sharing her perspective of this. And I'm sure some people listening will be like, you need to share my perspective as well. Um, but in the show notes, I'm going to put clips to a bunch of different articles or other things on the NCAA side of things and link to the congressional testimony as well that I did and that Katie did that has really gone very, very viral in the world out there. So yeah, thanks for listening. I please like send in comments on this, comment on LinkedIn or wherever it is, because I think this is an issue that we've only scratched the surface on its effect on our children. Okay. Thank you to our Patreon podcast champions who help us put this podcast out every single week. Thank you to all of you who subscribe and share this. Thank you to those of you who purchase our books in bulk or just single books. That all helps, Jerry and I put this podcast out every single week. And then, of course, our main sponsor, Sprocket Sports, just a wonderful group of people trying to make youth sports better through registration and websites and things like that. But people who their hearts are all in the right place. All right. So remember, your influence is never neutral. And I think this week's podcast gave you a lot of things to think about of how maybe you can use that influence in your community to put a little more play back and play ball. All right. See you again next week, everyone.